Hello, everyone. It's good to see so many people here at this Hedgehog Noontime discussion. My name is Kyle Williams. I'm an editor at the Hedgehog Review. And these Hedgehog Noontime discussions are really great events and time for us to spend a little extra time to pause and consider a piece from a new issue of the Hedgehog or a related topic of concern. And we love having our contributors. And we have two great contributors with us here. So I just want to thank all of you for being here. Before we get started, I have a brief announcement. The spring issue of the Hedgehog Review, the theme of which is titled By Theory Possessed, is now out on newsstands. And for the time being, all of our essays and reviews from this issue are available for free online. So go to hedgehogreview.com to read from the latest issue, and you can see our latest web features and plenty of other things. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe so that you can receive the summer issue soon. The next theme for the next issue is called Theological Variations, and it includes contributions from Alan Jacobs, John Milbank, Charlie Riggs, and Anton Barbacay, as well as other pieces from Matt Crawford, who I think is here today, Rita Koganzin, Wilfred McClay, Martha Bayless, and many others. So be sure to be on the lookout for that coming this summer, and please subscribe and tell your friends. Our topic today is what's become of critical theory. As a form of scholarship dedicated to uncovering the hidden structures of power and domination in modern society, critical theory used to find its strongest support from the political left, particularly from intellectuals, academics, and activists. But these days, it seems like conservatives and post-liberals are the most prominent critics of such power centers as the establishment, the deep state, and the managerial elite. Now, critical theory hasn't simply shifted into a right-wing project, that much is clear. The left hasn't abandoned it or anything like that. It seems more accurate to say that critical theory has morphed into a style of discourse that has taken root across the political spectrum. Perhaps the most popular proponent of this style of discourse in recent years was Tucker Carlson, who was once a bow tie wearing Weekly Standard essayist, but now, or at least until he was recently fired from Fox News, America's most powerful spokesman for how seemingly every news event could be interpreted as a power play by the deep state or the managerial elite. It's not just a cable news thing, of course. More serious and intellectually minded post-liberals, post-leftists, and other political party dropouts at popular podcasts and online publications have been reaching for new categories of power or reformulating older understandings of domination to explain the COVID regime or the politics of gender and sexuality or many other things. So the question that we want to raise today and talk about is how did this transvaluation of critical theory happen? What's become of critical theory? We have two leading intellectuals and scholars joining us to discuss this question and more. One is Malloy Owen, a PhD student in political science at Stanford University, whose essay for the latest issue of the Hedgehog Review called From Frankfurt to Fox looks for answers in the twists and turns of the Frankfurt School, and in two thinkers who have carried on its legacy, Michel Foucault and Jürgen Habermas. We'll be discussing that essay and other things today. And also joining us is Michael Weinman, a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture here at UVA and professor of philosophy and politics at Bard College, Berlin. He is the author or editor of 6 books, including recently Hannah Arendt and Politics, written by Maria Rybiskovich. He is also written with Maria Rybiskovich. He is also the author of Hannah Arendt and the Loss of a Common World for the latest issue of the Hedgehog, an essay that examines Hannah Arendt's acute understanding of the social and political dangers that have attended forms of critical thinking in the 20th century and that have inadvertently diminished real engagement with public life, which is obviously related to our topic. Now, one more thing about the format. I'm going to hand this over to Malloy Owen for 15 minutes or so, and he'll present on his essay and this topic, and then over to Michael Weinman for 10 or 15 minutes to respond. And then we'll have a brief back and forth, and then we'll have a Q&A. And that'll be a time for all of you to join in the conversation if you'd like. And when the time comes, you can raise your digital hand on Zoom to get in line to ask a question. And also feel free to comment or ask a question in the chat, and we'll try to get to that too. So Malloy Owen, thank you so much for being here to talk with us, and you can take it away.
Great, thanks, Kyle, and thanks to all of you for coming. Yeah, so I mean, just to sort of summarize, so the original kind of twin puzzles of the piece and what Kyle and I were talking about when we first started talking about me writing this are these. First, the contested but widespread application of this term critical theory to a certain mode of discourse and political practice on the left, a mode that I think a lot of us find it hard to define precisely, but there's a sense that something is going on, right? So I think, Wesley Yang calls this successor ideology. There's kind of various terms for some shift in the way that especially cultural politics is done on the center left in some pretty mainstream institutions, universities, foundations, et cetera. So Christopher Rufo, a name that has to come up, I think, in a discussion like this, is kind of the branding architect here. But he's the one who I think is principally responsible, especially for the use of this subterm critical race theory to describe a certain way in which progressives have begun to and increasingly begun to talk about race. But even if you see Rufo's interventions as pure cynicism, and he himself gives us some reasons to do this, there is clearly something that's changed. What is it? There's this talk about structures, which is ubiquitous, and there's also this deep preoccupation with media and visual culture as forming, or at least channeling and redirecting desire into, let's say, places it would not otherwise have gone. Unnatural, I'm not sure. But this style has been referred, the style of doing and talking about politics has been referred to by many names over the years. So for a while in the 2010s, there was the everything is problematic era, where we had the habit of calling cultural products problematic. It's a way of suggesting, there's something that they're doing to us that we want to criticize, but the word problematic has this kind of nebulous character also, right? In some ways, it absolves you of the responsibility of defining very precisely what's going on. That word seems less in vogue now, but I think also earlier, in some ways before my time, actually, there was this debate over political correctness, and I think this amounts to much the same thing. That was another kind of conservative branding of this style. So media and culture were out of alignment with the correct political disposition or stance. And so feminist theorists like Susan Oken were talking about politicizing ordinary and seemingly harmless gestures and practices back in the 80s. And many, though not all of the issues they were raising remain central today. And this is not even to mention the original critical race theorists in legal academia, people like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and others, who are applying this lens specifically to the law. But again, I think the force and reach of this mode of analysis, especially in the center left, has grown immensely during this time. So I TA at Stanford as a PhD student. Undergrads here usually come in without having read any philosophy because, as we know, it's not taught in American high schools. But they know these discourses intimately, and they can deploy them in class against somebody like John Locke. So they intuitively look behind his words to see the hidden operations of power. And one could also talk here about diversity trainings and diversity education in schools, as I do in the piece. So these trainings have as their objective uncovering a world of discursive power that's invisible to participants normally, and they reveal hidden double meanings in seemingly innocent utterances. So what are theorized as microaggressions, like asking a person of color where he or she is from, are now codified as serious and actionable offenses in many workplaces. So this, again, somewhat rarefied unmasking discourse has actually become mainstream. It's become a matter of workplace policy. And this hyper-attentiveness to context that's characteristic of critical theory is finding this very concrete political expression in a way it did before. There's a lot more one could say about this, but in short, right, interesting things are happening on the left, and they are referred to sometimes as following on from critical theory, and there seems intuitively to be some sense to this, so I try to develop that. Okay, the second of the twin puzzles is the development of this critical sensibility on the right, and Kyle referenced that in the introduction. And there's a certain symmetry here the whole piece could have been like about Chris Rufo, right? Because he's also a leading figure on this side. Maybe it takes a demotic critical theorist to know a demotic critical theorist. So Rufo has made this public name for himself, examining precisely these diversity trainings in school curricula that I was just mentioning, finding these hidden power dynamics in them. And then, of course, there's our news tie-in, because Tucker Carlson, as Kyle said, was this kind of virtuoso of right-wing critical theory, and doubtless he will continue to be whatever he ends up doing now that he's left Fox. So for Tucker especially, and also for these more philosophically inclined but less publicly prominent figures like Michael Anton or Curtis Yarvin, who I think inform the kind of Carlson elite theory, but are, they're writing for smaller audiences and in less accessible ways. But there is this elite theory here, which is that there are powerful people who want our society to move or continue moving in a certain direction, and they're using cultural discourses that operate in this subterranean way in order to accomplish these goals. And the substance of the analysis varies quite a bit on the right, as I suppose it also does on the left. So for someone like Anton, the core phenomenon is this class war, a coalition of high and low against the middle class and the families who embody the bourgeois virtues. And you can also go elsewhere on the right and find unsavory arguments about race that have the same structure. But the structure of this argument overall has a great deal in common with the one that's made on the left. There's a power structure that's trying to preserve itself, and it's using speech and discourse to do this, not altogether consciously. And it is possible, here's the prescriptive side, to carry out this great unmasking and to show that the words they want us to use encode false premises. These premises will work their way into our minds and into our children's minds unless we name and resist them. So I have a friend who calls these the logos wars, right? It's like the discourses themselves are seen as weapons, they're contested. So this is all, I find this all terribly interesting. I find it interesting partly because I myself am now kind of embedded in a very kind of empirically minded political science department where all of this, I think, seems to most of my colleagues like nonsense. So for me, I tend to take it for granted because I'm steeped in media discourses that now, of both the right and the left, that for which these are basic methodological assumptions. But in the Stanford political science department, right, the assumption tends to be quite different, that when we look out at society, we're looking at rational agents working within constraints. We want to secure the best possible outcomes within these constraints. And, the world is not exactly as we would wish it to be, but it can be better or worse. And by working with the materials of human nature and, our systems for the production of goods and so on, we can make the human world a little bit better. And this is exactly what the critical theories of both right and left are revolting against, I think. So the worry, the thought is that, from the kind of critical theoretic right, is that the center right is just accepting what the market is doing and saying, well, if the market gives us Disney, promoting this new social agenda that we don't like, well, that's just the free market. It's what people want. Nothing can be done about it, right? And so the critical theoretic right takes itself to be challenging this false necessity. And then likewise, the critical theoretic left says, the way things are now with respect to race or sex or gender is not the way that they have to be. And there's no immutable nature operating here, right? So it's possible to get behind and beyond this. In fact, what we take to be immutable nature, what we take to be the workings of the market or of people expressing their natural preferences, is actually constructed by this hegemonic cultural system. And so both sides are questioning this. And I think these, again, there's part of what interests me so much about this is there's a large part of our society, including, quite mainstream political figures for whom it's just obvious this is what's happening. And then there are people like my colleagues in political science who think it's absurd. It doesn't make any sense. So that's there's this interesting kind of right-left convergence on method, which is then resulting, I think, in even deeper conflict between right and left on substance. Okay, so just to say a little bit more about the article, I attempt a definition of critical theory as a style, and I try not to get too bogged down in the details of the Frankfurt School account, although I begin from it, because I think that if we're talking about these contemporary political phenomena, we want to be talking about the way that something called, let's say lowercase c, lowercase t critical theory is being practiced. And the people who are practicing it are not necessarily reading a lot of early Frankfurt School critical theory. So there's some genealogical relationship, but we can talk about it independently and autonomously as a style that's being practiced. So the central problem, I think, for the Frankfurt School, and the problem that generates the critical turn, is the way that modern capitalist society generates these false necessities. And the plea of the modern, of the liberal, of the capitalist, of the bourgeois is always that utopia of the kind, let's say, envisioned by Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse is not possible. We have to work within the constraints of what exists, and the basic responding impulse of critical theory as a style then is to say that we don't really know what's possible because our thinking is shaped by the unjust and inhuman conditions that we live under. So this comes out, I think, in what Marcuse calls the contrast between one and two-dimensional philosophy. So the philosophy that takes man for granted as he is versus the philosophy that considers him in light of his higher ends. And also in Adorno's beautifully melancholy writings. And I think he poetizes this impulse wonderfully in Minima Moralia. And I have another kind of working paper on this stuff that I think one or two of you here have read, where I try to think about the resemblance to Plato. So Marcuse cites Plato as a model for this two-dimensional philosophy, the philosophy that doesn't just take what is as good, but considers the possibility of a higher nature that we're striving toward. And the recurring theme, and this shows up in Marcuse, but also I think very beautifully again in Adorno, is that we are in the cave, and there are images of theirs that I think very directly reference the cave. We're in the shadow world. We don't really know how things are. So the constraints that we're so afraid of breaking may actually be illusory. Now, for what it's worth, I don't actually think this is how Plato himself thought about our relationship to the cave, but that's another question. Certainly, escaping false necessity requires getting behind things and understanding hidden meanings, a kind of ascent out of the cave through speeches. So the problem that I try to raise in the piece in the end, and I'll express myself very ambivalently about this because I feel ambivalently about it, is that once you've decided that we're in the cave and there's no way of knowing exactly what the possibilities for us are, the result can be this kind of nihilistic, destructive zeal. And so in this working paper I mentioned, I've been thinking a lot about Nietzsche's worries about Platonism and kind of applying them also to this critical theory style. And so Nietzsche worries that once you believe there's this other world that's unknown to us, but it's there, it's much better than this world, but we also can't even see its outlines because the discourses we inhabit completely conceal them from us. A natural response to believing that the world is very bad, hating being in light of the good, right, is this kind of destructive zeal. And I think this is a way of characterizing something of what we see in our politics. So there's a strange union of nihilism and moralism that I think is present on both the left and the right, the critical left and the critical right. So moralism in the sense that there are very high aspirations for human possibility, and then a kind of despairing nihilism in the sense that the failure to attain those aspirations, and also the difficulty of even quite giving them substance, just results in an impulse to like tear things down. And so I try to image this in the piece through this picture of Scylla and Charybdis and the void that threatens to pull us in, right? That getting outside the cave requires some kind of destruction and dismantling, but the destruction and dismantling somehow perhaps begins to become an end in itself. And so I don't know what, I should stop. I don't know what to do or say about this ultimately. And again, the piece tries to express that ambivalence. I think in many ways, I don't want to give too much causative power to critical theory itself as a project, because I think it's a very understandable response to the conditions of modern life. We are actually submerged in this powerful media apparatus that shapes the way we think. And I think it is difficult for us to know what's possible for humanity, what's possible beyond the dominion of the machine. But at the same time, there's something very repulsive about this destructive zeal. I think, a lot of the overheated character of our politics, a lot of the sense of political danger that we're now encountering is precisely attributable to this impulse. And so I'm also in some ways inclined toward the kind of anti-utopian call to renounce some of these aspirations if what they're resulting in practice is precisely this kind of destructive urge. So I think I should leave you with that, but looking forward to discussing further. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Malloy. And we can turn this over to Michael Weinman with some thoughts and responses of his own.
Thanks. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Jay, for the invitation to make a contribution to this issue as well. Thanks, Malloy, for writing this really great piece that, as was mentioned at the outset, really echoes so many of the concerns of the piece that I wrote, which is about Hannah Arendt's kind of version of the same, really, the same concern that's grounded in this image of Scylla and Charybdis, that you referred to at the end of your remarks. So what I wanted to do in about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, to make sure that we have a lot of time to get the conversation going, is to really make 2 points as briefly as I can. The first one would be what I see as 3 variations of the Scylla and Charybdis trope in your piece, to which you've referred to in your own comments. So I'm sort of now reflecting on the way that you presented these, and I want to just briefly represent them and what's distinctive about the Scylla and Charybdis trope. I guess I want to think of it as a trope, really, in that sense, not just a motif or a manner of describing, but really as a method, in other words. So I want to try to bring that out a little bit more. Like you said a little bit earlier today, something that I think it's not quite a quote or something, but it's a version of something that really struck me in the essay itself, in the issue. So if I got it right in your remarks a few minutes ago, you said that you're interested in a convergence between the critical left and right on method that is causing greater and greater conflict in substance. I think substance was the word, forgive me if I'm wrong. So I take that as one key presence of the Scylla and Charybdis trope in the text. And just to make right, there've been a lot of gestures to proper names. I was really glad that you mentioned compact. And I don't know if all of us in this space are familiar with that and unpack that now, but it does seem really distinctive of the moment that you're describing, that we have an express, right? Like there's an outlet that has an express purpose of uniting, as you put it on page 32, something like uniting the critical left and the critical right against the hated liberal center. That's from memory, something like that. So I think that's one version of Scylla and Charybdis that's in the piece. And then you relate that in these like 2 central sections of the piece to the unmasking of Odysseus trope in the dialectic of enlightenment itself. So I don't want to, right, there'd be like the academic conference version of this that would go into depth, but I think that it's really important that there's an obvious, as you point out in the article, but didn't rehash today, and this would point to like my first question to you, there's an obvious preference between Scylla and Charybdis often, right? So in our everyday idiomatic way of putting this, it's like you're between a rock and a hard place, right? But obviously the rock is way, way better, and so I don't want, so this is the second site, I mean, right? That the presence of the trope itself in the dialectic of enlightenment and a kind of ambivalence on Adorno and Horkheimer's part as to what they're actually doing with Homer's trope. You know, I mean, for them, it's pretty clear what's worse too, I think. But I wonder if you think the same. Like, in other words, is there a productive tension between, let's say, the compact, you know what I mean, bringing together the left and the right against the liberal center? Is it a pox on both their houses? You know, is it is it about Fox being fair and balanced, or so on and so forth? You know, how do you see the relationship between those first two senses of the Skyla and Charybdis trope? Would be like one main question that I have to the piece. And then the third one, which I think you were kind of echoing at the very end of your remarks just now, and in a way that kind of rhymes with the last couple of paragraphs, right, of the piece is written, but with an interesting permutation, is really a kind of, here we are right now between Skyla and Charybdis, right? So it's critical, so it's critical theory as a style. So there's the two historical examples, which is how Skyla and Charybdis shows up in the critical left and critical right of today. Then there's the Adorno and Horkheimer in the dialectic of enlightenment itself. And then there's like your own standing back from those two cases, if I have this right, like at the end of the piece, where you're noticing, it seems to me, you're participating in the style itself, right? So in other words, this isn't a journalistic presentation of critical theory as a style. This is a critical theoretical presentation of critical theory as a style, if I'm not mistaken. And if that's true, and this would be my second question, and we have these three sort of manifestations of Skyla and Charybdis in your piece, then like what's actually different about right now? You know, by which I mean, like, hasn't there been a version of the critical left and the critical right with less sophistication, with less differentiation in a complicated digital media landscape and so on, but hasn't there been a version of this since at least the time that the critical theorists were writing, since they came to America and inspired thinkers on both the left and the right against the kind of Kennedy technocratic elite, as you experience it maybe at Stanford, right? If that makes sense. Like, why really is this different in 2023 relative to Camelot? You know, relative to 1953 or 1983. Is there more convergence in method that you think is generating more what we would call polarization in substance, or right, to like sort of help unpack that a little? Or would you characterize it differently? Are there, you know, is it, or do you not mean to suggest that there are these three manifestations of Skyla and Charybdis? Have I sort of gotten that wrong? So that would be point one. And point two, which is briefer, is just kind of like, for you and for us, like, what about Arendt? I mean, just to say, right, Arendt shares an awful lot with Adorno. The two of them couldn't stand each other, right, personally, but obviously it does sometimes feel like, you know, kind of myopia based on being too similar. And I just wanted to throw out there, with respect to the second small question, with respect to the first point, that is to say, what's different now relative to all the time since the original critical theorists, or I should say the original Frankfurt School critical theorists came to the United States. I think Arendt would have a version of an answer to that question, which I think is different from your to your diagnosis, and maybe would get us into the Foucault and Habermas interesting things that we haven't really spoken about at all today that are in your piece. And I just wanted to call attention to Arendt's Homer. So it's like Arendt and Adorno and Horkheimer both go to Homer critically in their mid-century reflections on the catastrophe, or whatever you want to call it, on the Shoah. And what's different, I think, is that, well, what's different basically is that Arendt goes to the Iliad and not the Odyssey. And the reason why that matters is that what Homer has in her mind, or the trope that she extracts from Homeric epic is not the twisted, right, tropological Odysseus, but the impartiality of the Iliad, right? Which it's not only Arendt who's very impressed by this, but the way that the Iliad begins by, in the proem, as maybe most people here know, but right, just to say that the poet, in invoking the muse, yes, wants to sing the rage of Achilles or whatever, but wants to do so that, right, the greatness of the Achaeans and, right, their enemies can be preserved. And I think that that's, right, you can feel the similarity to Scylla and Charybdis there, but I think it's really telling, right, that Adorno and Horkheimer go to Scylla and Charybdis to bring out this, you know, neither this nor that moment, whereas Arendt goes to the Iliad to get the Achaeans and the Trojans. And I'm just wondering, not to put you right, but like, this is like why I like Arendt and not Adorno or something. That's a stupid thing to say, but like, your essay ends not hopelessly at all, but without a particular conviction, as you say here. And I just wonder if you see that, like Adorno, as a positive, that we have to do like negative dialectics or whatever you want to call it, but that's, you know, or in other words, like, why not the Arendtian call for impartiality? Like, that feels like a response to the three versions of Scylla and Charybdis that you identify. Do you think with Adorno that kind of impartiality is obsolete or impossible, or that it's ideological, or do you know, I don't know if that's a fair question to you, Malloy, but like, what does critical theory as a style have to say about that? And that would be it for me.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. Malloy, I just invite you to respond to that however you'd like. If I don't want to summarize in short what Michael just said, but what I heard there was basically two questions. What's different? Like, what's the difference between 2023 and 1953 or 1983? And then what about the Arendt option? But there's a lot there to respond to. So Malloy, you can do that if you'd like.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Michael. I mean, it's just it's terrific to have the piece read and discussed so seriously. It's very exciting for me. I think I'll say first, I mean, some of this may involve sort of kicking things back to you a little bit, but I'll just allow myself to do that, I guess. My read and what I want to do with Adorno and Horkheimer's own use of Scylla and Charybdis is just to say that for them, it's the image of a false dilemma. And so I do think, I mean, if we were in such a dilemma, and I do say this in the piece, like I think, you know, finding some way to face up to the painful necessity of losing 6 of your crew to Scylla's 6 heads, right, is like presumably the thing that sort of statesmanship calls for or something. And like what that means in practice and like what the number of crew that get lost is and so on, right, is, I mean, these are like important empirical questions. But once you think that you're in that kind of a dilemma, then I think you are kind of thrown back into the sphere of basically something like empirical political science or political evaluation. And I took them to be saying, you know, this is just the wrong diagnosis. And actually, that's not the kind of question that we're facing, because we can't even begin to ask the empirical question because we don't really know what we're looking at. We're living in this world of constructed meanings, et cetera. So that was how I was thinking about it. But I urge you to kind of correct me or to deepen that understanding of what they're doing in the text, because I'm very open to the possibility there's more going on there that I didn't properly pick up on. I think on the second point, this is an extremely important question. So the question of what is different now, and I want to answer it not really by talking about ideas, but by talking about something like material and cultural conditions, which is just to say that, as I was trying to suggest at the beginning of my remarks today, I think that we live in a time in which these discourses are much more powerful and widespread than they were in earlier iterations. And some of this, I think, just has to do with our media environment. So I was thinking today, I don't think I said this, but when I was preparing my comments, I was thinking about how you can see critical theory as a style on TikTok, right? Well, I don't have a TikTok, but I mean, they surface once in a while, right? You can find teenagers talking on TikTok about normalizing things, right? About problematic media. The style, I think, is disseminated kind of more and more rapidly. It's a style that I think is somehow very well suited to digital media, which has this kind of pastiche quality, constant commentary. And it's also a style that is appealing at a time when the deluge of images is plainly exerting such a powerful and far-reaching influence on our thoughts. And so that condition of being confronted with these images that we feel shaping us, right? So, a line I love from Minima Moralia, from Adorno is, every visit to the cinema against all my vigilance makes me stupider and worse, right? So he had this experience, he'd go to the movies once in a while, right? And then come out feeling kind of dirty. And like he was in the grip of the machine. Well, okay, so now we have smartphones. So it's like every time I open my smartphone, it makes me stupider and worse. Well, I do that, 400 times a day, right? So there's a sense of ubiquity that I think is that people sense, right? It's greater and more powerful, and so the stakes are higher. The possibility of catastrophe is more immediate and more present, and so then discourse critique of the kind that these people on the left and right engage in seems more urgent. And I think I'm not sure there's really a way out of this kind of media trap either, right? And that's part of the difficulty is, you can turn the TV off, or you can get a dumb phone for yourself, but this is the way that information moves now. And so there's a sense that it's just more and more we're more and more kind of networked into the global hive mind, and what it does affects us more and more. Things happen more rapidly. There's a sense of like accelerating cultural movement also. And so these are the conditions to which I would attribute this sense of heightened stakes. And I think these problems were urgent, when Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse first started raising them, but I do sort of understand the sense that they are more urgent now. Yeah, it's sort of a modernization story, I guess, in some generic way. And then the Arendt option. I think, I don't know if this is okay, Kyle, but I guess I just would love to hear you, Michael, just say a little bit more about what this is, because I think what I was trying to grapple with in the piece, I think, is just this sense of despair and inescapability. So if we are, impartiality is impossible if we are actually surrounded by these deceptive and delusive discourses that prevent us from seeing what is clearly. Okay, so that's just a claim about the reality that we inhabit, and finding a way to get out of the cave, ascend out of it, right, to cut through this confusion is presumably the political task that we should undertake if we can, and especially if we can do so without plunging into the void. And so, yeah, I would just, I am looking for hope here, and I think that the piece, as you said, is an attempt at a kind of critical examination of critical theory, and it's kind of a personal project, and it's one that I undertook. I undertake precisely, I think, out of a desire to see my way out of this. But I have to say, like in researching it, it did not kind of improve my mood about these things, and so yeah, it might be good for all of us to hear a bit more about this other possibility. So yeah, thanks.
Michael, would you like to respond?
I see their hands already, so maybe just super briefly. Firstly, thanks, Malloy, and it's really great. And I think, yes, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. Like Adorno and Horkheimer and Frankfurt School of Critical Theory is just much better about media, right, than Arendt is. She just wasn't. So I think that's like plus them, And then maybe on the other side, the thing is though, and I think you've like excavated it really well, is that the epistemological convictions of Adorno in particular, Marcuse is completely different, and that would be a separate. But if we're just sticking for the Platonic resonances in in Adorno and Arendt, and then the ones in Marcuse. I'm fascinated that you're working on that. I'd love to hear more about it, and that they're less spoken about. But I think the big difference is just that, right? Like maybe Arendt is overly optimistic about at least the possibility of escaping ideological formations in the age of cultural sort of constant, as you describe it, only more so, right? The movies make you dumb when you go for 90 minutes once a week or even every, but there's a limit. Whereas now, right, like social media make us dumber every second, and that kind of thing. So I think all that's right. Probably Adorno's right about that, and Arendt doesn't have a good story about it. But the flip side really would be the impartiality point, right? Like Adorno's going to go to the mat for the idea that impartiality is impossible. Arendt's still arguing that objectivity, you could call objectivity an ideological formation in a critical theory, in a Frankfurt School kind of sense. She's not going to argue about that. She's not going to go to the mat for objectivity, but she is going to go to the mat for impartiality. And I think that's just a live debate, right, that I would throw back to the room or whatever. I don't think we should give up on the idea that impartiality is possible. And that's a benefit, let's say, to reading our current media landscape through Arendt, even though there are certain things that she's just not going to help us to understand. Something like that. And that might be the way our two pieces relate to each other in some way.
Yeah, thanks. My sympathies are very much in your direction, Michael, and I guess in Arendt's. And I do think somehow, I can sort of work myself into this state of kind of frenzied despair over these things. But we do look around ourselves. We do look around us and actually see people doing what seems to be impartiality. And you can explain this away. You can subject it to further withering critique, and you can kind of make it disappear. But I do think this kind of primary experience that we have of something like what she's describing is a place to begin, and maybe a reason not to indulge this destructive zeal that I'm worried about. So yeah,
that's great. Well, we're gonna move toward a Q&A time. So please, if you're interested in asking a question, you can raise your digital hand on Zoom. I see Stephen White and Jay Tolson already in the queue. I'm going to take the moderator prerogative to ask a question of my own first. And this is directed to both of you, and it's more, I suppose, a kind of speculative question, but I'm curious about the relationship between critical theory as a mode of thinking, as a style of discourse in our political moment, and what it says about our political moment, and the changing, I guess, about what it means to be a successful political movement these days. Malloy, you write in your piece, as a style, critical theory is in many ways a rational response to the massive accumulation of mechanisms of power over the past century. And so in this sense, it's a kind of, I take to be a kind of material explanation for why this style has become more popular. It also seems to me, as a matter of intellectual history, that critical theory is a thing that intellectuals and activists and movements, and this has happened primarily on the left, resort to when they are experiencing failure, or they have experienced failure, in order to understand what's become of them. And that leads me to the question: as we live in a weird moment in which it seems like all political movements are kind of like failed movements. It seems like everyone feels beleaguered and under threat. And so what does it mean to be exercising, to be using this tool of critical theorizing when you are in power, when you are, or at least you have a likely claim to power? Ron DeSantis or Tucker Carlson on the right come to my mind as people who are either in power or very close to power, exercising police powers, but yet they're resorting to a tool of thinking that's been used primarily by people who are far, far away from those kind of centers of power. And I'm just curious if you could speculate or talk a bit about what you think that means about our political movement, but also what kind of corrupting influence that does to the whole project of critical theory. Malloy or Michael, both of you, would love to hear your thoughts.
I'll indulge myself in responding a little bit more like a political scientist and less like a student in philosophy, at least at first, and see where it goes. But I think, I mean, part of what seems interesting is, I mean, Kyle, your formula is very nice, right? That all political movements are failed movements, and yet they also, it's like something like they all also take themselves to be on the verge of a great, stunning, and permanent success, and that's part of the difficulty. So if you think, I mean, if you think about this all as sort of a bargaining problem, which is not exactly the right way to think about it, but it's like a first approximation. I think the motives for cooperation and coalition building are absent because our political life seems so finely balanced. And it seems like everybody has some hope of actually seizing and exercising total power. That's exaggerating it, but really kind of strong, meaningful political and cultural power. And so it's precisely that dangerous hope, I think, that makes the resentment over not commanding the means of cultural production so acute. And so yeah, critical theory, as you say, comes naturally to a movement that feels like it's on the outside, and it feels like its opponents have captured these kind of means of discourse. But I think also the existence of the mechanisms of information production and dissemination, and their power and their reach and the rapidity with which they can affect the way that people think and act, holds out this promise that if you could just kind of get the right institutional outcomes, then you could control them, and then things would go your way. And so, yeah, I think part of the kind of bitter intensity of these discourses results from this strange and dangerous combination of extreme hope and extreme despair. That is partly just a result of, the very fine balance between coalitions that we have in our politics now.
Yeah, I think that seems like a likely explanation to me. Not only were we so profoundly polarized, we're also very deeply entrenched, and so everything is everyone's this close to winning and also this close to losing. Michael, do you want to weigh in on this, or we could also go to other questions? But
yeah, maybe. I mean, just to say that really sharply presents why Arendt isn't a critical theorist, which matters not for intellectual historical reasons, I think, but because what she is an advocate for her very idiosyncratic understanding of Kant's critique of judgment as a political philosophy. And what that means is that, I mean, I think her the Arendtian diagnosis of exactly this thing that Malloy is describing, and that you just recapitulated, Kyle, would be that, and that's the title of my piece or whatever, but is the loss of the common world. In other words, that the way that politics in a democratic society is supposed to work is that a modern democratic society is that we form these political parties, and the political parties are basically aggregators of less and less partial positions on matters of public concern, right? Like that's exactly what they're doing, to think a little bit, right, from an empirical perspective in Arendt's terms, like that's what should be going on. And what we're missing is exactly that subjection of our own way of seeing the world to the judgment of others, which is, these things are all etymologically related to, right? So that judgment is crisis. That's what that is, right? Going back to the Greek. And so she's not a critical theorist, or she's against this sort of constant eviscerating, destructive aspect of critique, but trying to emphasize the public, constructive, imaginative aspect of judgment as, right, like a positive critique of building something together. But that requires a common world, and we're losing that too. So yeah, if we don't contribute to the common world, we have no chance of kind of bargaining in the way that Malloy was saying at the beginning of this.
right. Well, I have a lot of thoughts and things I'd love to say, but I would really like to hear from people who are been patiently waiting to ask a question. And the first is Stephen White. Thanks, Stephen, for being here. And please take it away. Let's see, Stephen, you're muted. There you are.
So, thanks, Malloy, for the paper. It's grounds for a lot of good thinking. I want to, I mean, to me, in some sense, you're absolutely right about the attractiveness of now, not just to the left, to the right, of this kind of notion of radical critiques of power. There are intellectual reasons for it, but I think it also, in terms of popular culture, it's just like, you don't want to appear unsophisticated, so you want to radically create, you want to show you're not controlled by things, and that's an extraordinary phenomenon. I'm convinced by your paper up to the section on Foucault and Habermas. Then I think things get a little more difficult for me. I think you're generally good on Foucault, and I think Foucault is probably the one who is the most, I don't know, responsible is not the right word, but Foucauldian analysis of power is what is just every place. Now, but with regard to Habermas, you go into him and then you sort of begin to back off. You talk about his mildness, and then you dismiss him with something of a non-argument, it seems to me. You would say, quote, "No one is ever taken to the streets to fight for the theory of communicative action," unquote. In other words, he's just this narrow intellectual nobody pays any attention to. Maybe not mass motivation, but if the last line of your paper where you say, need to think about some sort of political order beyond the dominion of the machine, I would suggest you dismiss Habermas rather quickly. And I mean that in the sense that if you think about the world of politics, there's probably no bigger in terms of number of people involved research program than the one around deliberative democracy. There are literally hundreds of people from throughout Europe, the United States, particularly at Stanford, who are involved in all sorts of efforts to create modes and practices and institutional designs that enhance something like the idea of trying to encourage impartial thinking about an engagement of people in the construction of what would be democratic. It seems to me you might have done better to either drop and say, I'm just talking about the first generation of critical theory, or engage Habermas a little bit more seriously, it seems to me there. And then finally, just, if you're trying to look at how you put something together, there are ways of thinking about both that kind of Habermasian deliberative moment and all that implies philosophically, and I don't want to even go into that, and the Foucauldian analysis of power. And simply, I won't try to go into what I'm talking about here, but remember there was an interview of Foucault, most extraordinary bunch of lines I think I've read in Foucault. And in that interview, there was Richard Rorty and Charles Taylor and a couple other people. And I assume it was Taylor who asked this question. He said to Foucault, are you against all disciplines? I mean, discipline seems like it's everywhere. And Foucault answered and said, well, consensual disciplines are better than unconsensual disciplines. Well, that's a rather interesting remark. But I think that's the kind of opening that would come back towards someone like Habermas. That is, analyses of power in a Foucauldian way is a first step. Redescribe everything as power, then you're still left with those same normative questions that we've had in political theory since the beginning. So I guess I would have liked to have seen a kind of different trajectory to the end of the essay that maybe engaged some of those kinds of questions more. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, this is very helpful, and I think principally it's just going to drive me back to reconsidering some of these questions. And so I appreciate what you've said, and I think yes, the engagement with Habermas. I mean, the article was probably already longer than it should have been, and perhaps you're right that I should have just let him alone instead of engaging in this perhaps somewhat superficial way. I do think. I mean, I've had my share of kind of encounters with this deliberative democracy research agenda here, and I find it very interesting. And have been very impressed by some of the things that come out of it. I think overall, I mean, I guess I take myself in the piece to be trying to confront that hope with the kind of full weight of what I take to be the concern, both of the kind of first Frankfurt generation, but then also of the political actors now who are for whom these problems are, who are wrestling with these problems, for whom these kind of discourse traps seem inescapable. Okay, so why hasn't deliberative democracy been adequate to address these people's concerns? Maybe just because it's in early stages as a practical project. More deliberative polling needs to be done, right? Some of this like mini public work, things like this. There's room for these to advance and develop. But I think, I mean, when I've been to workshops on deliberative democracy papers, and as I've read criticisms of them, it just like it remains so easy and tempting to look in and find ways in which even the most kind of purified discourse space is still subject to these pressures. And so you bring people in and put them in a hotel for the weekend and bring experts to talk to them, but who chose the experts? And and I know these problems are thought about very seriously by people who are working in this area, but I don't see now in the state of at least what I've read, the kind of methods that would be required to really persuasively overcome such fundamental epistemological concerns as an Adorno has about how it's possible for us to free our thinking from these ideological structures, given the pervasiveness of media and these other kind of vectors of contamination. So it is ultimately, I think, just the piece is maybe ultimately just a confrontation between those two ways of thinking. And I think you're right that I should have taken the other more seriously. And the point about Foucault is a very interesting one. I mean, I want to think more about what exactly, like how far consensual disciplines could get us. I do think that Foucault is not always as zealously destructive as I sort of caricatured him as. I think he perhaps represents a tendency, or let's say some of his more zealously destructive work represents a tendency that is attractive to people, and perhaps more attractive than his more moderate reflections. And so I was using him partly just as an image of a way that you could respond to this predicament. But yes, it would be, I think, for exactly that reason, very encouraging to find in Foucault himself the beginning of some resources for a movement out of the dilemma. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Stephen, and thank you, Malloy. I just want to remind everyone that we'd love for you to join the conversation. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand on Zoom. And Jay Tolson, editor of the Hedgehog, please jump in.
Thank you, Malloy. I would just like to throw another word out there, the C word, since a large part of the motivation behind this issue was to get into the question of conspiracy thinking and how central conspiracy is to the modern liberal order. After our issue came out, I saw this issue from Social Research, 15 essays on conspiracy thinking by scholars, leading scholars all over the world. And one of the pieces, for example, is Conspiracies and the Liberal Imagination. But there are numerous others, conspiracy thinking, COVID, and so on and so on. An interesting volume. But I think there is something, and I would just, rather than go into a long discussion of it myself, I'd just like to throw out the word that and the idea is there is something about this sort of the tendency of actors, political actors, even those who are in the media sphere, positing, always the view of this powerful other group, even when they're in power. It's essential to this conspiratorial style of thinking that there is a group that is really there pulling the strings, and that we, even if we're in power right now, even if we have huge influence, are really trying to unveil, disclose, demystify the workings of that power structure. And is this something that just seems to be inevitable in liberal modernity, accelerated now by the effects of our new media? And it seems to me that Malloy gets into that in some interesting ways, and others do in the piece. Phil Crittman, who writes the last piece in this thematic treatment about his piece is titled something like the monster discloses himself, goes directly into the sort of continuities between certain intellectual critical theoretical styles and popular conspiracy thinking. But I just throw that out there. Malloy, I know the last part of your essay, which you didn't talk about much about today, is the way identity issues have displaced the old concerns with class and economics and so on. But
yeah, thanks, Jay. I think I share a lot of this analysis, and I have come to see the conspiracy theory as the myth that arises to explain a lot of the things that I think critical theory also tries to explain. And so in a certain way, critical theory is more cautious about the claims it makes, right? So the conspiracy theory is the really kind of crude, oversimple, and also just like more obviously factually false account of how this kind of network power is exercised in complex modern societies. But in a way, the conspiracy theory does precisely make something like this critical theory analysis available. And I think also, the conspiracy theory and critical theory as a style share, I think, the utopian impulse. So part of what I find interesting about the conspiracy theory is precisely that it's so deeply hopeful. It looks despairing, but in fact, the thought is that if there are some relatively small group of bad actors who are controlling things for their benefit and who are responsible for all these ills, and if they were just put out of the way and replaced by virtuous people who are all around us, right, then our troubles would really be over, and there are these immense human possibilities that would be opened up if we were freed from the grips of these people. And I think this is exactly also the hopefulness of critical theory, which is also more measured in its hopes ultimately, because partly because I think it specifies them a little bit less precisely. But yes, I think in response to your kind of provocation, I guess I want to say, to the extent that critical theory as a style is inevitable, and I've tried to suggest that it is, I think conspiracy theory as a style in a lower and more popular form of discourse is also inevitable. And the same causes produce them, the same kind of incomprehensibility of the systems of power that we've built to manage and administer our lives. And I think they're both here to stay, and we'll have to learn to live with them. And the conspiracy theory can also produce some of the same destructive zeal, I think, as well. So, the kind of sporadic relatively few, I think, but the kind of outbursts of violence, I guess you might say that January 6th, insofar as that's kind of a product of QAnon, is a pretty major violent expression of this desire just to destroy things, right? And I think the destroying urge was a really big part of what was motivating those guys. So yes, I think I've just kind of long-windedly agreed with you for the most part, but I see them as very tightly bound up, and I think an analysis of one can tell us a lot about the analysis of the other, and vice versa.
Michael, do you want to jump in there?
I maybe just wanted to say that, and thanks, Jay, that in terms of the ubiquity and if it's a feature of liberal modernity, I would want to say that I think this idea of a common sense and a common world that we have in Arendt, but also without reference to Arendt, is picking up on something that's been true really since Descartes. So what we call conspiracy thinking, you know, when especially in its most paranoid form, right? So there's paranoid conspiratorial thinking, but then there's also just sort of relatively benign conspiratorial thinking that everyone indulges in, I think. In a world, in an environment in which there isn't a common world like our own. And Arendt's diagnosis, that which I think is very perspicacious, is that this really is rooted in nothing in particular political, but something fundamentally structuring of the modern, which is the Cartesian dream, right? Or what other people have sort of diagnosed that way. And so you get more and more pernicious versions of it, and of course it intensifies, and there are versions of this that are not at all benign, but even the most benign version of it, which is just the sort of solipsism that high and low seems to infect thinking, from Arendt's perspective, is truly ubiquitous in modernity, insofar as she diagnoses it, common sense shifts from what it had meant. So the phrase common sense is one that's been part of the lexicon for the history of Western thought, but it undergoes this fundamental shift in the 17th century from the sense that is common between all the senses, meaning it's the way that we, you know, whatever the exact material mechanism, it's the way that a human being is able to put together the different sensory impulses from out there in the world, and then something like that. And then all of a sudden, what common sense means is some inner light, you know, right, as Descartes has it. And so long as the common world is still there, that's relatively benign, because then it just means we all have our own inner sense of things, right? And then we get the problem of other minds, not that they ever match up, right? This is a modern problem, because before that, the idea was that whatever your common sense object is, it's the same as mine because it's out there in the world, right? And with Cartesian dualism, now it's only inside our own heads. And so we have this problem of getting out of our own heads, and that's a conspiratorial problem. So it is baked into the cake of modernity. Is rumination on Jay's point about its ubiquitousness. It's not about a political form of being a critical theorist or practicing the hermeneutics of suspicion. It's just insofar as we're all Cartesians who think that our perception of the world, and if we agree with each other that the lamp is green, it's because something inside each of our own heads is the same and not something out there in the world. This is a basic element of our world picture, however sophisticated our understanding of our epistemologies are. And that's a problem. I mean, I think, and Arendt's right, that like, that's a problem. And then it's a problem that gets exacerbated when we put ourselves in the media silos, and then we have the, you know, the sort of social media advanced versions of this that Arendt herself doesn't have a kind of awareness, it doesn't have a toolkit to help us understand. But the basic problem's been there since the 17th century, right? Which is that conviction that I know that you know that I know that you know that neither of us is actually seeing a lamp over there. And that, you know, that might sound like a joke, but I mean, if that's true, and it's not only Arendt who thinks this, but if we are all Cartesians, that gives us a basic problem to even before we start doing politics.
Okay, let's move on to Paul Nedaleski, who's been waiting for a bit, and also just like to invite anyone else to join in after that if they'd like. Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks, and thanks, Malloy and Michael, very interesting. My question or comment is very closely related to what Michael just finished saying. because I have not thought a lot about these things, but it struck me that, and it's maybe an essential, or if not essential, a really important part of this problem today, and the ubiquity of critical theory, is the remove at which each of us stands from the common world, or the attempted common world. You know, because of technology, because of media, we have the ability to potentially know about things very far from where we are, you know, or to put it in Michael's terms, very far from our own mechanisms inside our own head. But as soon as that is the way that we're gathering information, there's even this added layer. So it's no longer we have trouble agreeing with our neighbor person standing next to us because maybe their cognitive equipment is different from ours. Now there's added distance between what we're trying to know about reality and the suspicion of the evil demon, to use Descartes' metaphor, returns in another way. You know, how can I trust this account of what happened in Washington, D.C. or in Ukraine or whatever? And so I had been thinking, maybe, you know, prior to your last comment, Michael, I had been thinking, well, is there sort of a half measure, a tentative approach that could be made where the common world is maybe attainable in a very restricted local fashion? I have no idea how to fix this problem with you know, the evil demon of, you know, the distorting effects of the interest of power concerning accounts of things that happen far from individual experiences. I don't nothing to say about that. I just don't know what to do. But, you know, if there's any way to try to move toward a common world, could like something like a more localist emphasis have some merit? It doesn't fix the problem you're talking about, Michael, but I take it you at least remove, you know, one of the two evil demons. Either of you, do you have thoughts about this or reactions?
Michael, I think you should go first, but yeah.
Well, I'll say what I would think Malloy would say, or whatever. You know, the person inspired by Adorno, I think, would thank you, Paul, by the way. I mean, and I mean it genuinely, in the sense that you're stimulating me to kind of think all the thoughts that I was thinking in response to Jay's invitation to write something for this issue. So I think that is the basic idea there, that aren't what's good and productive and helpful in our end. And this rhymes with Stephen's point about deliberative democracy, I think, you know, in its adjacency, in particular to participatory democracy. And there are other versions of this, but localism or involvement, in other words, engagement, like direct physical engagement. But, you know, there's an Arendtian version or other versions, but this impulse to say, get involved, you know, right? I mean, how do you reconstruct a common world? Get out of your house, you know, right. I mean, get off the phone, this sort of thing. And I think there's some hopefulness about that. But then the Adorno, I feel like the Adorno view would be, there is no getting off the phone. And I don't know which is right in a certain way. Like, you can put your phone away, you can go on detox or whatever, but our lives happen that way now, right? Like, there is this shift. And that Arendtian answer, that speaks to me. Like, I feel myself summoned, right? It's like her, why Tocqueville was so inspiring to her. Like, I'm inspired by that too, but we do not live in Tocqueville's world, thank God. I mean, you know what I mean, right? We do not live in the 1830s and 40s. So I don't know, so I'm torn, right? So that makes sense. So I think that's right. I mean, I believe that it's right, that there is ameliorative, not a cure, right? But there's a treatment for the hyper-mediated version of the loss of the common world. I don't know, as you say, right? I don't know how in the world we could possibly ever put Descartes' you know, demonic demonic thought experiment back in the cage or whatever. Not because what really matters there is the idea that really we only experience the world through the mediation of our own sort of mysterious internal configuration, whether it's demonic or whether it's libido or whether, right, you could cash this out in other terms, but then we're in the therapeutic or whatever. And I don't know how we'll ever get back out of that, right? Like the guy, you know, Dick Bernstein, right, tries to get outside the Cartesian dream too. And others have also, and I think there's that ship has sailed, so to say, and that's already a pretty big deal. So we can do less badly than now, but I don't know how we ever do well again.
And it may be just one last thought. You might disagree. I don't really think most people are concerned about the things that Descartes was worried about, and I don't see lots of disagreement between individuals about basic sensory experience. But I think that what Descartes was really responding to was a sort of new and very violently fractious pluralism in the wars of religion. And so really it was the growth of these different interpretive communities that were affecting how people perceive what had value, what was worth pursuing. I'm not sure that helps, but at least maybe, the common world of common sense, as you were describing the older view, that might still be accessible. What we can get out of that that's productive, I don't know, because that doesn't get you the value. So thanks for your response.
I'll say something that is, as Michael anticipated, I guess somewhat pessimistic about this, which is I think it's quite interesting that, going back to the question of conspiracy theory, just as a framing, the kind of paradigmatic conspiracy theorists, I think in the 90s or whatever, was like a guy, like a radically solitary guy with like a sign, like walking around on the street, right, saying like this thing that nobody else believed happened. And then maybe there's sort of a, like, these guys find these very small, strange groups of, affinity groups, there's people who, a few people who agree with them, and they kind of talk themselves into more weird stuff. But like, there is this deep solitude of the conspiracy theorists, like gesturing at the whiteboard with all the pins and strings on it and so on, right? And this, I think, is not, that's bad. And then what we have now is worse, right? Because what we have now are actually pretty robust communities of people who have, I think, in many ways, like they do share a world among themselves, and they don't with the opposing faction. And so they actually reinforce their indifferences. They reinforce the kind of insulation that separates their thinking from that of the rest of the world. And so I think this is even, localism, there's like a kind of localism that would be living with people who think differently than you about certain questions, and then, getting along with them on practical issues or something like this. But I think that a lot of the localism that we actually have, there's all this, not to reduce this just to the question of political polarization, but that is the most basic and widespread of these phenomena that we're talking about. And there are kind of like more complex and difficult versions up the chain. But as far as political polarization goes, we know that there's a lot of geographic polarization, in fact, and this is increasing. And so localism, commitment to the sharing a common world with the people that you see face to face every day might actually result in the further disintegration of a really shared understanding of reality. Now, what I don't know how to do, Michael, is to fit this in with the Cartesian story. So is it like you can get a little bit outside your head, but ultimately you're like, and enter into these communities, but then, so the community have a kind of shared understanding, but then they're radically separate. But this seems to be what's going on. And one does want to kind of attribute it somehow to some variant on the Cartesian problem, but I don't know how to do that. I like the story. I think the kind of story of polarization now, it looks like like Mercury beating or something, right? It's like we get these completely opposed, but actually highly internally consolidated cognitive bodies of people. And this is what happens on the internet. So some people complain the internet's too fragmented. Some people complain it's too conformist. And actually it's both. It's conformist within these fragmented groups. And so that's why I think just talking about localism or the recovery of some kind of common, like one person getting outside his head and finding other people, is not enough, because that does happen and it just makes things worse. So
we had a comment here from someone in the chat that I think Edward Strickler puts his finger on something, right? He says, of course, we differently perceive our circumstances and experiences of our circumstances, but we cannot, except by persuasion or coercion, ensure that others confirm our perceptions. So will a common sense humanity, quote unquote, survive by persuasion or coercion? That is the current set of political and cultural ideological struggles. I want to invite Judd Owen, who's raised his hand, to jump in with a question.
Yeah, thank you, Malloy. This was terrific. And Michael, thank you. Yeah, if C is for conspiracy theory, and I was thinking along the same lines that was an important element to bring into the discussion. D, I would suggest, is for demagoguery. To what extent does that help us think about what's happening right now? It's as old, I would suppose, as democracy itself, that there have been elites or would-be elites who are appealing to the passions of the people and telling them that the powers that be are against them, and if only you side with me, then the problem will be solved. And this is obviously a much more sophisticated version of it, but just, yeah, demagoguery. I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, thanks, Uncle Judd, and for coming. Yeah, it's not a side of this that I thought about, but it's a side that I would, now that you raise it, want to integrate in some way into this account. And I think part of what I like about it is precisely that it puts this story in a much longer kind of historical and theoretical line of context and understanding. And so I think, yeah, I mean, mostly maybe just to agree that, I mean, I've been thinking a little bit recently about the connection between tyranny and phantasm in the later books of Plato's Republic. I mean, tyranny precisely does bring about this dream world, I think. So the tyrant, I think, is said by Socrates to be awake what a dreaming man is like. So also prey to these controlling passions that most of us manage to suppress, maybe except in our dreams. And these come to life as false and controlling images for the person who's given over to tyrannical passion. And so, yes, I mean, there's clearly some link. And again, I don't know how to relate this to the Descartes story, which we were just discussing, because for Descartes, right, the retreat into the inner citadel seems to be about reason, but it looks like maybe if you have a sort of Socratic dialectic understanding of how reason and understanding work, you might think that it's actually passion that cuts us off from the common world that we're discussing. And so, yeah, there's no doubt that, as essential object of the criticism of the media criticism of the Frankfurt School was exactly, this is the kind of Freudian element, which I don't know well enough to speak on at any great length, right? But the claim was precisely that not just our reason, but some very deep and kind of difficult to control and understand drives are being activated and channeled by this kind of language. And I guess I just believe that's true. And this opens up maybe, it points toward the possibility of some, putting some hope in a recovery of reason as an antidote to this kind of demagogic use of information control. So yeah, thanks very much for that.
I'd just like to draw everyone's attention to Michael Weinman posted a piece an essay that he wrote for a public seminar on the chat that pertains to democracy and tyranny. Isaac Reed, you have a question?
I do. So I mean, one of the things I want to talk more, or would like to hear more about, and about the piece is that, this, I really like and admire the aspect of this piece which does this thing of trying to kind of track and talk clearly about trends in, broadly sort of intellectual academic culture and their interaction with trends in the sort of broader political culture. I mean, this is a really hard and difficult thing to do. And I guess my question is sort of to ask you to talk a little bit more, and maybe Michael too, about, I mean, I guess about sort of like what the words are that we want to use to describe you know, these exchanges or what's happening, because it's very interesting to me listening to this whole discussion that on the one hand, there's a story here about polarization and passion, let's say, or something like that, right? In the sense that, you know, people become, you know, not only convinced by conspiracy theories, but let's say deeply invested in them in some way or another. And of course, there, as Malloy laid out, there's some sociological causes of that, which is you're less alone or something, in the sense you can find your compatriots on the internet or something. But I guess my real question here is, I mean, on the one hand, it's clear that this essay tracks polarization and the kind of brinksmanship of the bargaining model that Malloy laid out. On the other hand, there's a lot there that we have despair. And I kind of wanted to ask about exhaustion. I mean, there's a kind of interesting and hard question here, which is, on the one hand, this is a story about the kind of ramping up of the paranoid style in American politics qua intellectual life or something like that. And on the other hand, there's this sort of sense throughout the essay that what's really happening here is like, well, I mean, people are just kind of exhausted with railing against, you know, a sort of techno-economic system that is so ubiquitous that, well, you might as well just be a critical theorist on TikTok, because, I mean, really, what else is there? And I would just sort of point out that, at least at a kind of very basic common sense level, these would seem to be very different emotions, or different, let's say, different collective moods for us to have, or something like that. And so I guess my question, which is not particularly well formulated, but would just be something like, can you talk a little bit more about what your sort of theory of collective mood is here? Because it seems to me that on the one hand, we have a theory of a kind of polarization and you know, the aligning of sides and the ramping up of intense passions and sort of hatred of the liberal order or something. And on the other hand, we have a kind of mood, which is sort of like, well, what is the project really anyway in late modernity? It's, you know, we're already 35 years after the end of history. Things are definitely getting boring. I mean, you know, sort of, right? I mean, you know, I mean, what's the point of doing any of these things, really? I mean, so, and these seem to me to be not obviously commensurate ways of thinking about collective mood or political culture. And maybe that's just because they're adhered to by different sets of people or different subsets of the cognoscenti or whatever. But I just want to hear more about what you think the mood is that's operating in this world that you're describing. Because it's interesting, for example, to think that, you know, we're like, one would imagine that if one had a way to think about the mood of American politics, that, you know, when Hofstadter published The Paranoid Style, one might ascribe a different mood to American politics than one finds now, or something like that.
That's a really great question. Go ahead, Malloy. Sorry.
Thanks, Isaac. Yeah, I'll sort of cheat and like lean on other people here. So James Hunter has drawn my attention in this context, and his thinking about what he talks about as a kind of contemporary nihilism in our discourse to the first few sections of Nietzsche's Will to Power, right? And one of the moves Nietzsche makes there, thinking about a moment that is in some ways similar, you know, and also I think, as Nietzsche often did, thinking sort of prophetically, foreseeing some later developments, is he distinguishes between active and passive nihilism and says they're both sides of the same phenomena. And I think that maps on actually very nicely to what you're describing, Isaac. Like you can respond if you have this kind of despair, this hatred of being in the name of the good, which I think, you know, a lot of us are experiencing right now. You could respond with kind of feverish activity, partly maybe just as a way of addressing the agony of not being able to do anything, right? Is precisely that you throw yourself into this kind of feverish activity. Or you could respond with that, what I think you're very sharply and analyzing very nicely, right? Which is this mood of kind of like nothing, we can't really do anything, and you know, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, and like you can just sort of do what you want, and like nothing matters very much. And you know, the world's going to end because of climate change in like 10 years also. So there's that sense of what I always call like Gen Z nihilism, which is probably unfair to many Gen Zers, but it is, I think, a mood that I do see. I mean, more among undergrads that I encounter here than in my own generation, right? There was that kind of what they see as the sort of silly optimism of the millennials, which is now replaced by this this kind of etherealization. And yeah, I guess I'll just sort of invoke Nietzsche's authority and say, like, these are both cogent responses to the premises that I've been trying to discuss in the piece. And I don't know what determines which side a person falls on, but one can kind of understand both impulses as springing from a common root in that sense.
I wonder if this too has something to do with what we were talking about earlier about how it is perceived by, it seems to me, most people in their political movements, respective political movements, that their political movements are failing. And as you were saying, Malloy, that there's a feeling that you're just this close to victory, and yet it's quite out of grasp. And I don't know if that's the same thing as exhaustion. It seems like it could be kind of rage filled, actually, but it does seem analogous. But we are at time, actually past time, so we should probably bring this to a close. I just want to thank you all for being here for this Hedgehog Noontime discussion. I especially want to thank Malloy Owen and Michael Weinman. Thank you so much for this great conversation and for taking the time to write for us and for taking the time to talk about this afternoon. I just really appreciate that. And I invite all of you to go to hedgehogreview.com to read more and subscribe. A lot of really good essays in this spring issue, and they're available for free right now. So visit there, subscribe, tell your friends, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.